Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I am so pleased to welcome you to this session of the Learning Exchange Series, the 2019-2020 lineup with the Forest Climate Working Group. I'm your host. My name is Lauren Cooper. I lead the Forest Carbon and Climate program at Michigan State University. And we've been very pleased to lead this year's Learning Exchange Series in partnership with the Forest Climate Working Group. For those that aren't familiar, the Forest Climate Working Group is a diverse group of forest interests with over 50 members, including landowners, industry actors, conservationists, academia, and those active with carbon markets. The group has worked together for more than 10 years to advocate for state and federal policies that work to ensure sustainable forest use and prevention of land use change. Here is our current lineup. For those that aren't familiar, we have had a few years of our Learning Exchange series. We've already completed a number of these sessions. They're all recorded, and you can view previous sessions and sessions from previous years as well. But if you see something of interest here, please feel free to register to one of our remaining upcoming sessions so you can get announcements. To move to today's speakers, I'd like to introduce Taryn Finnessy, Senior Policy Advisor for the U.S. Climate Alliance, Kristen Schmidt, a Climate Change Adaptation Specialist of the USDA Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, or NIACS, and Rebecca Turner, the Chief Strategy Officer of American Forests. Today, they'll be focusing on the U.S. Climate Alliance's regional learning labs for the natural working lands, which convened throughout the fall of 2019. From these speakers, we will learn about the learning lab design, objectives, and outcomes for participating states, and how these activities fit into the broader objectives of the Climate Alliance. We are very excited to let our speakers get started today, but before we do, I'd like to share a few housekeeping details. The first is to automatically receive registration details and information about upcoming webinars. Please email forestc@msu.edu to join our mailing list. Attendees today are qualified to receive 1 CFE credit from SAF, Society of American Foresters. These are automatically communicated to SAF, and you'll receive credit if you've registered for this webinar with your information on your SAF account. But if you have any questions about this, please reach out to us at forestc@msu.edu. This session is being recorded and will be posted to the web along with any supplemental materials, including presentation slides and relevant links. This will happen in the next week or so. If you've registered, you'll receive an email letting you know when this happens and where to find it. The session today is followed by a Q&A. We do collect questions throughout the presentations. On the Zoom interface, you will see a chat option on your menu bar. And this menu bar can disappear on you during the webinar. So if this disappears, just float your mouse around the screen and your menu bar will pop back up. This has a little drop-down triangle next to it. Here you can offer up questions at any point during the presentations. And this is important because we do have 3 speakers and we don't want to lose any of the questions that you might have as we move through the speakers. But throughout the presentations, we will compile these questions and present them to the speakers in a Q&A session, kind of a panel session at the end. And this is, of course, time permitting. So in the case of any outstanding questions, we'll work with our speakers to make sure that these are addressed, and we'll put them together in a Word document, and these will be uploaded to our website along with all of the presentation materials and the recording that I just mentioned. If you are joining by phone, but you do have access to email and would like to submit a question, feel free to send questions directly to forestc@msu.edu and we'll work them into the question lineup. So with that, thanks so much to everyone for joining today. Again, thanks to our speakers. And Taryn, will you please share your screen and begin today's presentation?
Great, can you all see that?
Looks good.
Great, well, thanks for the opportunity to talk to you today. And I'm going to just give a quick overview of who the U.S. Climate Alliance is and why we are working with states on natural and working lands issues. And then we'll go into more detail on the outcomes of the labs and the next steps with the subsequent presenters. So the U.S. Climate Alliance is a bipartisan coalition of 25 governors that have committed to upholding the Paris Agreement. So that equates to a 26 to 28% reduction below 2005 levels by 2025 that we track and update on our progress on annually through our annual report. We also work collectively to accelerate policies that will further drive down greenhouse gas emissions and increase carbon sequestrations. We are a rather young organization. We've been around for about 2.5 years, almost 3, and we were stood up by 3 governors on the day that the Trump administration signaled intent to pull out of the Paris Agreement. We started as just 3 governors, and we have grown to 25, 24 states and Puerto Rico. Collectively, we're rather large. We represent 55% of the population and a GDP of almost $12 trillion. In emissions, if we were a nation state, we would be the 6th largest emitter globally. And so we are, our collective action does have the potential to really drive down emissions and have a global impact. How do we do this across 25 states? Well, we really focus on speaking with a unified voice and coming together, recognizing that representing 55% of the population and a large piece of the economy, our voice is powerful. So we're very, very cognizant of how and when to use that. We have defended clean car standards. We have worked to defend energy efficiency proposals. And we have had opportunities where we bring governors together to speak not only about what they are doing, but of the benefits of collective, unified climate action. We work through a series of work groups, which I'll go into in a minute, but we come up with policy examples and we do knowledge sharing. We create quantitative tools. We give states the opportunity to work collectively, to work through issues. We provide grant funding for both planning and implementation. And we do playbooks, which are really a menu of options for state policies to address a whole host of issues, both on the mitigation and the adaptation side. We couldn't do any of this without the support of our impact partners. We have 6 organizations that help provide the technical support to the states to do this. We are state driven and we do not goal set for those states. The states have their own sets of priorities and we work to help them implement those priorities. So far in our short lifespan, these multi-state strategies have been proven, and what we are seeing is that through our collective action, we are able to instigate transformative change. We have 15 states working on rolling down short-lived climate pollutants, which are sometimes 1,000 times more potent than CO2. We have states adopting energy efficiency standards and committing to 100% clean energy. We also have within our natural working lands portfolio that deals with, that we'll talk about today, our largest and broadest participation across all of our states. And then lastly, because we were created as the Trump administration signaled intent to pull out of the Paris Accord, we really work to inspire action, not only at home in our states and our neighboring states, but also abroad. We want to discredit the notion that no one in the US is doing anything on climate change, and that in fact at the state level there is quite a lot being done on climate change, recognizing that there can always be more done and striving to do that wherever we can. This is especially important this year as we go into COP26, where parties to the Paris Agreement are being asked to bring increased ambition in November. So when we see opportunity, we try to raise awareness, or when we look for opportunity, we try to raise awareness on issues. When we see competing priorities, we find champions to tackle those. Where we see vulnerability, we try to create coordinated opportunities for coordinated action. If there is a lack of experience to act, we help build capacity to address those issues, both at a national level and through individual states. Where there is limited bandwidth, we try to help build bodies. Sometimes this is in the form of one state sharing information or staff or tools with other states. Sometimes it's through coordinated RFPs to hire consultants. Sometimes it's through our grant program. It can really look a whole number of different ways. Where there are limited access to resources, we develop partnerships to help meet those needs, and our grant program supporting the implementation and planning processes for the natural working lands is an example of that. In September of 2017, we issued the Natural and Working Lands Challenge. And this was a challenge leading into GCAS, the Global Climate Action Summit in San Francisco, to really advance different programs and policies that could lead to reduced greenhouse gas emissions and enhance land-based carbon sequestration practices. I'll quickly see if this video works. So we have 17 states that have accepted the challenge, or 17 governors that have accepted the challenge to date, as well as a number of NGOs and other entities that have signed on. We are working to increase our membership now and have modified some of the language to provide a 2-year implementation period to broaden our membership to get all 25 governors of the Climate Alliance on board with this. And with that, I will just add one more thing before I go to that. The Natural Working Lands Challenge, as part of the challenge, required identifying best practices and improving inventory methods. And these have been key focuses of some of the elements of the Learning Lab, and have been one of the things that drove the need to both have a Learning Lab and for multi-state collaboration. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kristen, and she can talk about what exactly these Learning Labs were and what we were trying to achieve.
Great, thanks so much, Taryn. And Lauren and Daphne, I'll just say if you can't hear me or if anything is unclear on the screen, please interrupt me and let me know. So thanks so much for that introduction to the U.S. Climate Alliance and everything that it does. As was mentioned at the beginning of this webinar, my name is Kristen Schmidt and I work with the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science, or NIACS. But the role that I'm going to mostly talk about today was really kind of helping the U.S. Climate Alliance and American Forests in designing and implementing this series of regional learning labs for the Natural and Working Lands work stream that we did last fall of 2019. And so I'm going to talk mostly about kind of how those were designed and what some of the things that we were trying to achieve were for those learning labs. First off, I just want to back up a little bit and mention the original Learning Lab, the initial one that took place back in the summer of 2018. So this was really focused on allowing states to work in their own state teams and really dive into thinking about natural and working lands and carbon sequestration on natural and working lands, and what kinds of things they wanted to start or continue doing to enhance carbon sequestration in their states. I think that's where really the term Learning Lab was coined, if I'm not mistaken. And the reason for that is that the focus was really on state work. It wasn't meant to just be a conference where states would go and hear a bunch of talks. It was really focused on that in-state working time. And so for 2019, we really wanted to continue that somewhat and help states get a little bit further down the road in terms of meeting some of their priorities for their natural and working lands and carbon sequestration on those lands. And as you can see, there were more states that had joined the U.S. Climate Alliance by the time that we began this regional learning lab effort. So in total, in 2019, we held 4 different regional learning labs, and 22 states in total participated in some form or another. I'm really glad that Taryn mentioned the Natural and Working Lands Challenge. A big focus of the regional learning labs in 2019 were to help states get a little bit further in fulfilling some of these listed items here. So as Taryn mentioned, work on improving those inventory methods and work on identifying and continuing best practices for conservation and management. Some of the challenges that we were encountering and kind of thinking about how to design these learning labs were just the fact that states were coming in at very different stages of thinking about carbon sequestration on natural and working lands. So, there were some that had been really thinking about this issue for a long time, even before the U.S. Climate Alliance had formed and before they joined, and some that were newly joined as of 2019 and just kind of getting started thinking about carbon sequestration on natural and working lands and about how their state climate plan was going to take shape. And as you can imagine, and probably many of you are already thinking, there are really big differences between states themselves, just in terms of what their natural and working lands look like, what their ecosystems are like, how stakeholders are using those lands. And so, states are coming at this from a lot of different angles in terms of what they might want to do. And kind of tied into that are just, differences in stakeholders within each of those states and what types of policies they might support, as well as what kind of direction that state leadership might want to move in and what they might want to emphasize. And so these were all kind of challenges in thinking about, okay, how do we bring everybody together and make some progress on meeting this natural and working lands challenge for each state? So a lot of those challenges were the reasons that we decided to hold a regional approach this time around. And this is just representing the states that were in each of the 4 regional learning labs that were held. So one reason we thought this regional approach was good is that, we could provide a little bit more contextual information for similar states. So for example, in the Western Learning Lab, we could tackle the issue of wildfire and carbon sequestration in forests in a little bit more depth or more intentionally than we might in other regions where that's not as much of an issue. So it allowed us to get a little bit more more detailed in terms of the actual context of natural and working lands in each state. Other ways that we kind of tried to meet the challenges of holding these natural and working lands learning labs were by really providing some regional examples and regional success stories up front to kind of let everyone in the region know, what are other states doing, what are they working on, what kinds of things are they tackling. And we really wanted to use our state large group time to address some of the common issues and common questions that we were hearing when we had discussions with states in advance of the Learning Lab, and when we did some sensing with those states when we were developing this agenda. And I'll talk a little bit more about those issues. And then we, of course, wanted to allow some kind of state group work time, sort of like we did at the original Learning Lab, so that states could hopefully get a little bit further in working on their specific issues and goals. So in terms of providing regional success stories, one feature of each of the regional learning labs were state fire starter talks, kind of towards the beginning of each learning lab, that really showcased some of the efforts that states were tackling. And we had tons of great examples to choose from. Many of these examples were actually things that got started or got a little bit further down the road in terms of being implemented at that original Learning Lab back in 2018. So it was really cool to see all the work that had gone on in the year between those 2018 Learning Labs and the 2019 Regional Learning Labs, and see some of the detailed efforts that states were working on regarding natural working lands and carbon sequestration. We also had time for different experts working for a variety of organizations to present on their areas of expertise. So we had, experts from different NGOs, we had folks from private industry, we had folks from federal organizations and from academia. And in many cases, those individuals were working very closely with state teams to help them answer specific questions related to their own natural and working lands priorities. So, for example, we had experts discuss kind of the quantification and the scientific side of thinking about how different agricultural practices might sequester carbon. And then we had people speak more on the policy side of, how do you build a program that integrates carbon credits with water quality credits, for example. I mentioned that we wanted to allow states a little bit more group discussion time and state-to-state discussion time in this lab. And that's something we really didn't have at the original Learning Lab just because we didn't have time. But in this one, we were hearing a lot of similar questions come up from state to state as we were designing the agenda for this. And so, for example, one of the subjects that we tackled in some form at every regional learning lab was this question of uncertainty. So, for example, uncertainty in how exactly to quantify the carbon benefits of a certain forestry practice. And so, there were lots of questions that came up and lots of states getting hung up on this question. And we wanted to spend some group discussion time, both tackling that from an inventory and a quantification and a scientific standpoint, talking about, what can you do to improve your inventory? What are some new techniques for carbon quantification? But then also talking about that from a policy standpoint. So thinking about, even if we're dealing with a certain level of uncertainty in carbon sequestration, how can we tackle that in our policy design? And so that was a subject that was built into each of these regional learning labs in some format. Another common issue that came up, or common question and area of interest between states, was the issue of, how do we build on existing programs in natural and working lands to kind of enhance those carbon sequestration benefits? And we had a lot of discussion about that at these various learning labs. So, for example, what are those benefits of existing programs in terms of carbon that you might be able to take advantage of, or that you might even just be able to take credit for? And so there was a lot of great discussion that came up on this. And then finally, we did want to make sure to allow some in-state work time, as I mentioned. And, since states were coming into this process at a variety of different stages, we tried to provide an overall framework, kind of help focus conversation and focus state discussion about next steps. And so really we were trying to help move states through a trajectory of thinking about, okay, what specific practices on natural and working lands do we want to incentivize, and who are the stakeholders we might be working with to do that? And then kind of moving into questions of how we might do that, how we might go about identifying existing programs or developing new programs that can address those practices that we want to implement. And at each Learning Lab, we did provide a facilitator that worked with each state to kind of help explain this framework, help take notes, and help kind of guide or listen to states as they moved along this trajectory and kind of create a cohesive set of notes. And this is just a little bit of a teaser slide for Becky Turner, but these are some of the things that we hope came out of those regional learning labs in terms of outcomes. And I will turn it over to Becky Turner now to talk a little bit more specifically about some of that.
Great, thanks so much, Kristen. And thank you to everyone who's joined us. Not hopefully, I know that what my colleagues have shared gave you some insights into, let's get this from the beginning. You saw my last screen, great. And I expect Lauren and others to tell me if they can't hear me or see my screen. So I'm Becky Turner, Chief Strategy Officer for American Forest, and I oversaw the design and implementation of the regional learning labs. I want to thank my colleagues, Kristen, Taryn, and everyone else involved, many of whom I see are on this call right now, for all they did to make the learning labs such a success. As Kristen noted, the goal of these labs was for states to work together, to learn from each other, and to wrangle with the issues they face, and to take that back to the governor's offices with clear goals, plans, and next steps. In order to do so, we needed to create a safe space away from media and other spectators so they could speak openly about their work without worrying that they will be quoted or be seen as getting out in front of their governor's initiatives. Therefore, while my examples today will be specific, they will not be attributed to any states. The names have been removed to protect the innocent. As Kristen noted, we learned during these regional learning labs the results from our previous national learning lab held in DC in the summer of 2018. What we learned was that states brought the work that they did in that lab back to their governors, back to their agencies, and we saw programs were implemented, legislation was introduced, budgets were adjusted, goals were set. Therefore, we can expect to see more results to come this year, stemming from the state's work at these regional learning labs. The outcomes of the labs fell into a variety of buckets. Integration of natural working lands into state climate plans, adjustments to existing programs and budgets, as well as the proposal of new programs, identification of research and data needs, ideas for drafting legislation, and ideas for how to implement legislation that had already been passed, as well as regional and topical collaborations. So first up, we've got our state climate plans. As mentioned before, states were coming to the table at very different stages. In every region, we had states with comprehensive plans already in place where natural working lands were fully integrated. And so they were looking at how to implement those plans and turn those goals into reality. One Western state spent their time at the Regional Learning Lab looking at tweaking programs and budgets to maximize the mitigation potential of their natural working lands. Others at the Western Learning Lab were putting together a strategy just to get natural and working lands recognized in the state plans that were already being drafted. In other regions, some states were trying to get natural working lands integrated into the broader GHG mitigation roadmaps. A number of states were working on implementing no net loss policies that were stated in these plans. And it will take time to know the results of this work, but in the next National Learning Lab in August of 2020, we will be hearing from these states on the status of the integration into their state plans and how they have started implementing those plans. A key target for states was identifying programs that we called climate programs in disguise, looking at existing efforts for natural and working lands that they could tweak to measure climate benefits, carbon sequestrated, et cetera. For example, many of the Mid-Atlantic states were looking at their water quality programs related to the Chesapeake Bay Initiative and how they could also identify and integrate the climate considerations. We saw also in the Mid-Atlantic groups focused not just on ag and forestry, but also integrating their programs for healthy wetlands. Some states at these learning labs were developing numeric targets for their natural working lands within the broader state climate goals to include metrics to guide state agencies that aren't overly burdensome. Other states were looking to create new programs to incentivize private landowners to adopt climate smart mitigation activities, management activities. And states with existing climate plans were interested in establishing working groups or advisory boards to turn their plan elements into specific policy and budget proposals. Many of these states identified the capacity issues, not just at the state level, but also at the local municipality level that would be needed to implement some of these larger plans. They also found the need to also address the capacity issues at the state level and where they could find support to bring all of these programs, both across Department of Agriculture and Department of Forestry or Natural Resources, and have folks who are able to look at these across the agencies of the states to move these forward in a clearer pathway. Others were looking, of course, at their budgets and figuring out how to increase funding to these programs. States also were identifying research needs to fill in knowledge gaps and the data they need to better account for the natural working land potential to meet their state greenhouse gas goals. Including help with monitoring and quantification tools. Working with experts in attendance, these states were able to also flag what expertise they will need and the possible collaborators to help them reach these goals. While most of the efforts from these states, given that many of them were agency folks, were focused on the administrative side of governing, looking at the existing programs, new programs, data needs, others were working on the legislative side. Coming out of the first National Learning Lab, many states proposed, and some even passed, state legislation that they had developed in their work sessions in 2018. The states that didn't get their legislation passed worked in the Regional Learning Lab with their stakeholders to better understand the concerns they had with the original legislation and figuring out how to put together a process for the next draft that it would address these concerns. States that had passed legislation were working to figure out how to implement and enact that legislation that was passed. They, of course, as we know in how government works, if the legislation passes something, it's up to the administrative side of governing to implement. And so now that they had legislation passed, they were really trying to figure out how to deliver on the goals of that legislation. And many states were looking at those states that had used legislation to enact their goals and how they had engaged with the legislative branch for these larger goals. Both on the administrative side and the legislative side, states continuously wanted to learn from each other and figure out if this piece from that state and this section from that state are put together, then we can move that forward in our state. States who had similar political, where they had mixed parties, where the administration was one party and the legislation was another, where how do you move some of these goals forward that were part of the governor's sign-on to the U.S. Climate Alliance. Dividing by region, we were able to focus on the specific issues those states face because of their general similar landscapes. But it also brought states together on how to, it also brought states together to how to address similar challenges. For example, the Midwest is exploring a regional reforestation strategy, while the Western and Northeast states are looking at soil health initiatives across states, but also across all types of landscapes. The Northeast also identified needs to develop credible quantification tools for their carbon mitigation benefits as of avoided forest and agriculture land conversions. Western states were looking to collaborate on nursery capacity and infrastructure, specifically for post-fire restoration. We also heard on states wanting to learn from each other and continue this cross-pollination of ideas. And so we've been setting up communities of practice where we are continuously touching, having these touch points with the states across the entire 25 states, delving deeper into specific policy questions and program issues. On the forestry side, that includes post-fire restoration and wildfire risk management, reforestation, carbon-informed forest management, and shared priorities with federal agencies. All of this is leading up to a national learning lab in beautiful Minneapolis in August of 2020. Again, we will be bringing these 25 states together to engage along specific pathways and topics to learn from each other and advance their goals. While we focused on the regional level, we had many states that wanted to attend all of the regions, that they all wanted to learn what the West was doing on soil health because it could apply to the East or the Mid-Atlantic. Folks wanted to know how, as I mentioned before, different parties running legislation and administration, how do you work across those political barriers? And we see that in a number of the states across the country. So by bringing them all back together, we'll be engaging with them on the specific topics rather than breaking them out specifically by states. They are eager to learn from each other, to use each other's models, and see how, with certain tweaks, their efforts could be applied to the states' works that they represent. So that gives you all a kind of understanding of where the states landed and the continued work that's going on. A number of these states with their teams continue to meet, especially those that are cross-agency. And each state had facilitators, and many of these facilitators are still engaged with their state teams, helping them to move these ideas and these plans forward to implementation. And with that, I'll pass it back to Lauren. I believe I saw a number of things come up that questions folks might have.
Thank you so much to our speakers. This is Lauren jumping back in here to lead a Q&A. And we did leave a little extra time here to kind of have a sort of panel discussion. So I strongly encourage you to feel free to bring up questions now or anything that pops into mind. as we begin this conversation. To start off, I think this is most directly directed towards Taryn, but we wanted to loop back around to the Natural Working Lands Challenge, and wondered if you could speak on how does this challenge compare to other major activities in the Climate Alliance? Are there other similar challenges?
It's a great question. There are other similar challenges, although there is not necessarily a challenge for each of our 9 work streams. We also have the short-lived climate pollutant challenge that focuses on reduction of those highly potent but much shorter-lived climate pollutants like methane and HFCs. And that has been adopted not only by states, but also by countries. Canada and Mexico, as part of our North American Climate Leadership Dialogue, have signed on to that challenge as well. And really what these challenges were, because they're still going, are an opportunity for entities to show that collective action can be impactful and that we are all striving towards similar goals and objectives. And so it puts us on the same page as to what our outcomes our intended outcomes are, and gives us an opportunity to share best practices and mechanisms and policy levers to achieve those either emission reductions or increased carbon sequestration opportunities. So we do have a number of challenges that exist within the Alliance, and we will likely be releasing more. It's also an opportunity for non-Alliance states or entities that are not necessarily entrenched within the Alliance to engage with the Alliance in a more meaningful way.
That's really helpful. And a follow-up question related to the challenge as well. How are you assessing the ability of states to meet this challenge and the other challenges, but specifically this one? I know that the timeline's been extended to allow additional states to jump into the challenge, states that have joined the Climate Alliance more recently. But could you talk a little bit about assessing, or what are states really reporting about their participation in the challenge?
Sure, and yeah, we didn't necessarily extend the timeline for those who signed on 2 years ago. We had initially said it was by 2020, so we had given those initial signatories 2 years. And when we had additional states come in to the Alliance, we had 7 new states come in. They said, look, we really like the idea of this challenge, but you're asking us to sign on to something, or to consider signing on to a challenge that's halfway through. And that doesn't really set us up for success. So we changed it to just 2 years post joining that challenge. And the quantification piece, really important one. Like I said, when Alliance states join the Alliance, they commit to tracking their progress, and that's tracking their progress from all sectors, including the land-based sector. And so we do track progress through our annual reporting and modeling processes, but right now we're actually going through a practice to specifically track progress on where states are with respect to the Natural and Working Lands Challenge, to see if they are on track to meet their goals and objectives. And we hope to have that completed in the first half of this year. I'm not sure that it will be I'm not sure if it will be an external document or if it'll be an internal document for us to work with states to either accelerate their efforts as a result of the findings, or to maybe knowledge share if they're doing something that's been really effective. But we are working with states to do that. We've also committed broadly as an alliance to really work to improve our inventory practices within the land-based sector, and to come to some collaborative agreement, or to work towards some collaborative agreement on inventory methods within the land sector, which have kind of notoriously been a challenge. And so that's something we're really hoping to tackle within 2020, which will also give us a better sense of where we are in meeting our Natural Working Lands Challenge.
Thank you so much. And this question might be able to have some input from a few of you. Maybe Becky would have some ideas as well. Sorry to give you so many upfront questions, Taryn, but I think, again, you might have the most insight here. But the question is, what is the role of tribal governments in the USCA? And did any states assess the potential opportunities and challenges of integrating tribal governments into their budgets and programs?
Sure. So we had some representation, albeit limited, from tribal nations within the regional learning labs, and we certainly encourage states to include those tribal nations as part of their efforts and outreach, so that it can be a much more integrated process. I think the opportunities that we are identifying and that we are highlighting certainly transcend state boundaries, but they also transcend into the tribal nations as well. So we would like to create as much of a collaborative process for that as possible. Having said that, we are a coalition of governors, and so our coalition is not directly targeting or working specifically with those tribal nations, but we do really encourage our member states to work with them and support any efforts to do so.
Hey, this is Kristen. I can just comment a little bit on what Erin said. I did work with one state in one of the regional learning labs that had, tribal representation on their state team. And I would just add that, in that particular case, a lot of the conversation was along the fact that, this tribal nation they already had a climate adaptation plan. They had some documentation on carbon mitigation and carbon sequestration ideas for their landscape. And so the conversation in that case was a little bit more along the lines of like, hey, we've already got a lot of this stuff and we've been thinking about it. Here are some ideas that may be able to be scaled up to the state level or integrated at the state level in some way.
That's great. Thank you for that addition. Becky, did you have anything else that you wanted to add on this? I'm not sure if you've come across any examples or anything before we move on.
Please move on. Kristen provided the example I was going to provide.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Sorry to steal your thunder, Becky.
Oh, no, you were facilitating that state, so it was perfect.
Okay.
The one question we have here is there's an interest in learning about particular states' efforts. What do you recommend is the best approach to seeing what a particular state is doing, and how would someone that's interested maybe try to find that information?
Sure, I can provide some guidance there. While we were protecting the states because these were all new initiatives, the states are very eager to share what they have going forward. The pieces that have already been implemented, plans that have already been written. There are a number of states that ask for public comment. And so going to the climate change section in your state's government webpage can definitely give you a clear understanding of what they are implementing right now. A lot of the work that's happening at the learning labs was the future. What are the next things they can do? And a number of these states will, based on legislation or even on interests from the administration, are putting together advisory boards who are doing outreach because they want to hear from their constituents and because they want to show what the good work that they're doing. And so a number of these states not only have public comment periods, but will have public outreach activities. And then, of course, for those who are interested in legislation, writing to your state legislators on what you believe the state should be working on and what could go into a specific climate natural working lands legislation. And so it is very much public outreach opportunities and engagement, as well as looking at what the government's already talking about. And you can provide input on how to improve those plans that are already out there.
Thanks for that, Becky. Another question here is about the differences between the learning lab formats and their scope. So you mentioned, or we learned that the first learning lab, Kristen, you described this, was at the national level, and then in fall of 2019, we moved to a regional level. And I'm wondering if any or all of you could comment on the differences between those learning labs, and if there was some specific value in one format or another, if there was some specific benefits working at the regional level, and just kind of what those takeaways were.
Sure. With the National Learning Lab, this was at the beginning of the U.S. Climate Alliance formation, and states were just getting their heads around what they were signing up for, and what were the possibilities that their states could do on natural working land. So they looked at opportunity assessments, is what we called, of different pathways on ag, on forestry, even on wetlands, of where could they get the biggest bang for their buck on implementing programs that addressed those pathways. And so the first learning lab was very much focused on state teams. There was 16 or 17 states that were involved, and it was primarily state work with some interaction across states. And then as those states matured and continued their work, they were looking at how to learn from other states. And so the regional learning labs, one was engaging the new states that had signed on in the same way that we had with the National Learning Lab, but also to get that lessons learned across regional area, across the region. And that's where we could find some real collaboration and real ideas on, hey, Montana and Colorado are facing the same similar issues around fire resilience. Maybe we can work together, kind of interactions. And so while there was still state work, we did a lot more of across state learning. And then this final national lab will be very much across state learning, from the West Coast to the East Coast, north to south, to really help these states understand the opportunities and the barriers that other states faced implementing similar programs.
That's great. Did the other speakers want to chime in anything at all there?
I thought Becky covered it pretty thoroughly.
Yeah, I would just echo that opportunity for cross-state collaboration, and just recognizing that there's a lot of opportunities to initiate transformative change when states work together, like Becky said, and that's really what the Alliance is trying to focus on, are those opportunities for transformative change.
Thank you so much. We have a few questions here that are kind of clarifying who is both representing the states, and I think also who's at the learning labs. So that kind of could be the same. And I know, Taryn, you clarified that it's the governor signing on, but there's specifically in the labs, who's making up these group of, who are the state teams? So agency actors, and then specifically, if there's industry, what are some of the common types of industry that are there? So just some clarification on the makeup of the teams and how they're defined. Sure,
I can take that one. The states were putting together their own teams. There were representatives from the governor's offices. You had agencies, especially on the natural resources and ag side, and what we learned from some states is that their natural resources agency and their ag agency folks at the more programmatic level don't really talk to each other, even though they were addressing similar issues. And so that was really exciting to see states going, oh, maybe ag and natural resources should be talking to each other more often. States brought in universities, experts from local universities that were really engaged in their work. NGO representatives, we had a number of state chapter representatives from the Nature Conservancy who had been engaged with these states working on these issues. And then some states brought in their biggest industry, big forest landowners, industrial forest groups, because the pieces that they were trying to address and the policies they were trying to enact would impact these landowners. And so hearing from the landowners at the beginning of the process was a key piece for these states. So each state team was very, very diverse. We had some states that only brought forest folks. We had other states that only brought ag, and then we had these states that were composed of this variety of stakeholders and agencies.
And the only thing I would add to that is that they span all levels, from agency staff and technical experts within the state, like Becky was saying, but all the way up to the governor's office. So we do have some representation from not only cabinet members, but governor's office staff to help guide some of the decision-making processes.
And one state at the National Learning Lab, the first one, had a state legislator, a state representative on the team as well. Any more questions, Lauren?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, so for my final question, just last few minutes here, we would like to know a little bit more, how are states advancing? So how are they continuing this work back home, and how are they engaging with the Climate Alliance to continue to move things along?
So I can take that. Becky and Kristen, feel free to jump in. As I mentioned in my intro, this is one of our largest portfolios. Actually, it probably is our largest portfolio within the Climate Alliance. So we have 9 official work streams that are all focused on emission reductions, resilience, and increasing carbon sequestration. And this portfolio is the one that is most broadly engaged across our 25 members. What that looks like is we have monthly calls, and those touch on a whole host of different topics. We also do webinars or policy deep dives where we really tackle specific issues and try to cause. We are not an entity that shares information just to share information. We are very, very outcome focused, outcome driven. And so we are trying to identify challenges and then simultaneously identify ways to overcome those challenges. And so we try to bring in experts to do that. And then we also have a specific forest kind of sub of the natural working lands sector that is really trying to tackle some of the very forest specific issues, many of which came to light during the regional learning labs. Becky mentioned some of them: the tree nursery issues, reforestation issues, biomass issues. So all of these challenges, and we're bringing in technical experts who can help with that, but also bringing in and highlighting the successes that states have had. We try to really turn to our states that have identified these successes and have implemented policies that have been effective to help guide other states as well.
Great, thank you so much. And so we are on the hour here, it's 4 o'clock. So we are going to wrap up. It looks like we might have to follow up with an additional question or two, but I wanted to take a moment to thank our speakers again for their time. For those that are joining, just a reminder that this will be recorded and posted on our website. This happens in a couple of days. We will also share slides of the speakers. So if there's anything you wanted to go back and take a look at again, you'll have a chance to do so. And so with that, thanks so much to our panelists. We appreciate your time and your energy today. Thanks to everyone that joined, and we will see you all next month. Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.